Today's reading is in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 to 20. Verse 18 is a particular favourite of mine, and verses 19 and 20 are particularly difficult to interpret, so you can understand why we're going to focus on verse 18 today. So let's read. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. When we think of all the suffering that there is in the world, the suffering of individuals through sickness or abuse, of families through breakdown or other difficulties, or of nations, whether natural disasters or warfare, we might ask the question, is God oblivious to it all? Or does God really care about all the suffering in the world? Now, in answer to that, I want you to notice in verse 18 this word that's used, the word also. Christ also hath suffered. When I think about this, I find it quite astounding. The life of Christ was a life of suffering. Isaiah wrote that he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Matthew, in chapter 2 of his Gospel, wrote how Herod would seek the young child to destroy him. He endured taunts about his birth. We be not born of fornication, as they said in John chapter 8. In the life of Christ, indeed, Joseph disappears from view. In earthly terms, was it possible the Lord Jesus was an orphan? He was falsely accused. He was cruelly abused. He was crucified. He was impaled upon a cross. It would be hard to think of a type of human suffering that he did not experience. The life and death of Christ tells us that God is not isolated from our suffering, but has entered into it in a very real way. But that provokes this question: why would God enter into human suffering? Peter explains that Christ also hath suffered for sins. We suffer because of sin. Very often we suffer because of our own sin, our anger, our selfishness, the wrong choices that we have made in life. Sometimes we suffer because of the wrong that other people have done. Sometimes it is suffering of the innocents. Illness and natural disaster are indiscriminate in the suffering that they bring. But what does it mean that Christ suffered for sins? Peter explains, Christ suffered the just for the unjust. This is the suffering of a sinless substitute for those who are sinful. Sin ruptured the relationship that humanity had with God at the beginning and brought this world into suffering, and it would have condemned us to that eternally. But the suffering of Christ for sins was for us, the sinless one for the sinful ones. And it was for that grand purpose that he might bring us to God, as Peter also writes here. As the hymn says, he took my place and died for me. But look at this. Christ also hath once suffered for sins. Once in this verse means once for all, once and never again. How reassuring. The work of Christ is uniquely sufficient and eternally complete. It will never lose its power. As the Lord Jesus himself cried in triumph upon the cross in John 19, it is finished. God is satisfied. Salvation has been secured. And what assurance that gives to you and to me who believe.